All right, our next presentation is reflecting on the risk factors for safer markets in the future, the results of the FDA 2015 and 2016 Deli study. I would like to introduce Michael Nordos, Retail Food Specialist in the Office of State Cooperative Programs at the US FDA. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Tricinda. Happy to be here. So the FDA is in the middle of our second 10-year study on the occurrence of risk factors. And today I'm going to be presenting on the results from the 2015-16 data collection in the deli industry segment. This data set will be used as a baseline to assess trends in the occurrence of risk factors during two future data collections that will occur. So next slide. So data presented today was collected in delis from October 2015 to December 2016. The overall study also includes several other industry segments within the retail food industry. So if you're familiar with our, we did a 2013-2014 report on the restaurant industry a few years ago. So now we're presenting on the delis. So the other industry segments are, we do restaurants, which includes both full service and fast food. And we also look at institutions, which include hospitals, nursing homes, and schools. So just be aware that this is a small portion of a much larger study. Some of the objectives of our study are our goal to identify the least and most often occurring foodborne illness risk factors and food safety practices. We wanted to determine the extent to which food safety management systems and the presence of a certified food protection manager impact food safety practices. So this study has been specifically designed so that we can make correlations between those three factors, and I'll show you some of those results as we move forward. And then determining whether the occurrence of food safety practices differ based on establishment's risk categorization or whether or not they're a single or multiple unit operation. And we'll define those as we go. We use the results of this study to really guide, it's our guidance here at the FDA to see if what we're doing is working, right? How do you know if you're having an impact in your communities and if what you're doing is actually lowering the occurrence of the risk factors? So we use it to develop our retail food safety initiatives, our policies, our targeted intervention strategies, and anything that we're doing which is focusing on reducing foodborne illness risk factors. We're also using it to provide technical assistance to our state, local, territorial, and tribal partners, to identify some internal FDA retail food work plan priorities moving forward into the future, and to inform FDA resource allocation to enhance our own food safety nationwide. One of the unique things that we're doing now, which I'll show you at the very end of this presentation, is we've developed many new products to be more proactive in our outreach to everyone and our communication efforts. So all those products I'll discuss towards the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. So as I just mentioned earlier, this is our first data collection period for the deli industry segment in the current 10-year study. You can see that this is the first of three. So we always want to get three data points in order to analyze trends. The third one, supporting what we see in the second one. So I'll make a note that you can see on the slide that the second data collection period was supposed to occur from 2019 to 2020. We did begin that data collection, but had to pause because of COVID, just like a lot of other things that have been happening. So we are getting ready to resume that second data collection period coming up here in October, hopefully. So then the timelines obviously will be pushed back accordingly. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through some of the protocol and how the study is set up, just so you get a background. We often get lots of questions on the study design, so I'm not going to get too far into it, but I'll tell everyone some of the basics on what we're doing. So the facility type, so you must meet a definition. So a deli must be located within a retail food store in order to be eligible for this study. So what that means is a standalone operation would not meet the criteria of this study. So a deli that's associated with a larger retail food operation, your typical grocery store delis, things like that. You can see the definition of a deli up there, slicing luncheon meats. So if a deli, here's a key though, if a deli was responsible for other operations such as doing sushi or a salad bar or cooking products, then we also looked at those areas. So it's kind of amazing in the food industry as you get into what you typically see a deli. Oftentimes they're responsible for other things such as stocking a salad bar, or sometimes they'll cook and cool the rotisserie chickens and use those products, and even doing sushi and some specialized processes. So if those were also done and overseen by deli management or as part of the deli, they were included. If they were outside of the deli operation, then they're excluded. For the risk category, establishments eligible for this study fell into risk categories 2 through 4 as defined in the Food Code Annex 5. We did this because these food establishments represent more complex food preparation activities, which gives us a better chance at observing the specific behaviors and practices we want to see. So if we're trying to observe cooking, there's no reason to draw, risk category 1 that's not going to be doing any cooking. So they had to fall into 2 through 4 in order to meet the criteria for the study. The sample size. So our FDA Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition Biostatistics branch determined that a minimum of 384 data collections were needed in order to have sufficient observations for food safety practices. So that number is important because what that does is it gives us 95% confidence that the percentage that we're deriving from our data are within 5% of when they actually occur. So we have a very high confidence level in the data that we're presenting today. You'll notice that the sample size that we're talking about today is 397. That 384 is a minimum. We always shoot to collect more than we're going to need to make that statistical analysis in case for some reason we're unable to collect some of the data, such as one of our data collectors departs the organization or for some reason can't collect their data. So in this particular data set, we did collect more than we needed for the minimum. Next slide, please. So this slide shows where the 22 FDA retail food specialists who conducted the site visits throughout the United States at the randomly selected food stores are located. So all specialists are standardized by CIFSAN personnel on how to interpret and apply the food code before they're eligible to participate in collecting data. We go a little further than that. So after they're standardized, we also make sure all specialists receive customized training specific to the study data collection protocol and marking instructions and all the materials and the forms as part of our quality control. So they go through extensive training before they're released. The facility selection is done via a geographic information system, which contains a listing of all US businesses. So that's our establishment inventory. Retail food stores are then randomly selected to participate in the study from among all those that are eligible in that database within a 150-mile radius of each specialist's home. So that's what this slide is depicting. The total number of establishments within that sample zone for this collection represented 63% of all establishments in that retail food store segment that were eligible for selection. So of all the establishments, all the delis that were eligible and meet the criteria I just described, 63% in the United States fell within these circles. So we're within our sampling area. Again, just lending more confidence to the study. Next slide, please. Some quick notes on eligibility. So with the criteria I just mentioned and being eligible for selection, what we also did is before we get out there and start doing data collections, we always contact the state or local jurisdiction who has regulatory responsibility for conducting retail food inspections at the selected retail food stores. We do this for a couple of reasons. The first reason is we want to discuss with them, make sure that the facility is still open, that they're not under any legal notice, or that they haven't been misclassified. Maybe they're not really a deli, maybe they're more of a restaurant, like a sandwich shop or something like that. So we discuss that with the regulatory jurisdiction and make sure that we've classified things right. We don't want to be going into places if they're under enforcement action. So if those criteria were found to happen, we would discard one of the samples and draw from our random alternative list. The other thing we do at this time when we're talking with the regulatory authority is we do collect some information on their program. So we talk about whether or not they're enrolled in the program standards, the timing of their regulatory inspections, what they use for a grading system, posting of inspection results, what their certified food protection manager requirements are, if they had food handler training and things like that. So we do collect data on what the laws are in the local jurisdiction as well. All the data collections are unannounced. So we want these to be true to how things are happening on every day. They are not regulatory, however. They're just an observational inspection or data collection, I should say. So upon arrival at the establishment, we explain the purpose of the visit to the owner or the person in charge, and we give them an introductory letter which explains in detail the purpose of our visit in the study and what the data is used for, that we take off any identifiable information, and that it is voluntary. So, and we have actually very high level of participation by industry in this. Most of the time when I go in there, they seem fairly excited to see us and help with us. They get to be part of a national study, but it is voluntary. So if the establishment chooses not to participate, we just leave and select an alternative from the list. Next slide, please. So our study is centered around the CDC foodborne illness risk factors. And if you could advance just once. Can we click the slide one time, please? I think there's none. There you go, thank you. So on the left side, you see the 4 of the 5 risk factors. So we do collect data on approved source. So anyone who's looking and sees, hey, there's 5, and you got 4 there. Approved source, we do collect data on that as well. It's not one of the 10 main data items because it had a very high incompliance rate during our first 10-year study. So it is one of our secondary data items. It's data item 14. We just didn't want that to be one of the main focuses because it had a very high incompliance rate. So the study focuses on observations of food safety practices which are associated with the occurrence of foodborne illness risk factors. And those are what you see that were just highlighted. Those are our data items. So each risk factor has an associated set of data items, and those are the key indicators for our statistical analysis. So you see each one there is linked up with one of our 10 data items, which when I move forward, we'll be talking a lot about those data items. And then just a final note that the critical limits used in making all these assessments are all based on the current FDA food code recommendations. Click twice for me, please. One more time. So we advance to the next slide. There we go. Thank you. So these are information statements. So under most of the data items which I just showed you, there's a list of specific information statements which are provided. And those information statements describe specific food safety practices which are associated with the overarching data item. So the data collector is not actually marking the raw animal foods cooked to required temperatures. They're going through the standardized questions which are associated with the recommendations in the food code and making the determinations on A through F there. So this accomplishes a few things for us. One, we have a standardized form where we are, every data collector is marking based on a same statement and same set of criteria. And then there's a standard set of rules which determines the overall outcome of the data item. For example, in order for the data item 9 to be in there, all A through F would have to be marked in. If one was out, the overall data item would be out. Our data collection software, or our database, does all that calculating for us, so we don't have to worry about the rules. And I'll just put a quick plug in here that same exact database that we use to collect this and generate all our reports is available to all our local retail, state, local, territorial partners to use. You can do your own study, run your own reports. Everything I'm showing you today, you can do for your agency as well. And your retail food specialist or myself can help you get started with that or get access to it. So one of the things that we learned from our first 10-year study is that if you break down each of these information statements into their own data items, you don't get enough observations to make a statistical analysis overall. So for instance, if you pulled 20 establishments and you want to make an analysis just on the cooking of roasts, which is item E, you may only see that twice. or you may only have 2 establishments that even do it, and maybe you're there on a day they're not doing it. So you wouldn't make those observations. So what this does by having the information statements, which all are on how are we doing all cooking all together into the overall data item of cooking, it allows us to make those observations. So it accomplishes a few things. Can you, next slide, please? All right, for those of you who can't wait till the end to know the results, you're like me, you just want the good stuff up front, here you go. So of the food safety practices investigated in this study, delis had the best control over no bare hand contact with ready-to-eat foods and cooking of raw animal foods to required temperature. So looking very similar to what we saw in the restaurant segment. There remains an opportunity to improve with employee hand washing, which includes both when to wash and how to wash, as well as cold holding and cooling. So those are the areas we need to gain a little better control. We found that food safety management systems, which I will describe later, they were the strongest predictor of the compliance status of the data items. So an establishment, as they improve the development of their food safety management system, the average number of primary data items that were out of compliance were reduced. Delis also had a certified food protection manager who was the person in charge at the time of the data collection, had stronger food safety management systems. So then we can put all 3 of those correlations together and we can make the suggestion that having a certified food protection manager present and in charge at all hours of operation results in better food safety management systems and thus better control of the risk factors. And I'll show you the data here on how we came to these as we go on. Next slide, please. So remember from a few slides ago, I said that establishments eligible for the study selection fell into risk categories 2 through 4. So this is a breakout of how that random sample fell out. So of the 397 delis sampled, risk category 2 had 192 establishments, which was 48% of the sample. Risk category 3, 185, which is 47. And category 4 was 20, which was 5%. So the 20 establishments that were in risk category 4 was an interesting thing because we don't usually think of delis as being risk category 4, right? So what we found and what happened here was that some of the deli departments were performing special processes. So as I said earlier, if they were in charge of doing another process in the deli, such as juicing or making sushi, and that was under the control of the deli and the deli manager, then that was included in the study. So there were a few delis that were doing special processes, and thus we came up with those 20 establishments. Next slide, please. All right, we also compared compliance rates for single unit versus multiple unit operations. So a single unit means one location, whereas a multiple unit consists of 2 or more locations. So that would be something like a chain or a franchise, right? So the reason we did this is we wanted to see if multi-unit facilities have better control over foodborne illness risk factors due to infrastructure and resources of those type of operations. So the multi-unit operations made up 74% of our random sample. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an important concept to understand, so I'm going to spend a little time on this. So the formula you see depicted in this slide is a calculation of the percentage of the out of compliance observations for each data item. So note that the percent out of compliance observations for each data item represents the proportion of the establishments where that data item was found out of compliance at least one time. So if you see the formula, it's just simply the number of out of compliance observations over the total number of observation in and out for that data item. And if you wanted to calculate the in percentage, you just put in on the top. Same denominator, different numerator. So just remember that the data reported in this presentation and in our report is a proportion, not a rate. So I'll give you a couple examples of that so it's easy to understand. So let's say you have an 80% out of compliance for proper cooling. This means that there was at least one observation of improper cooling in 8 out of 10 establishments where cooling was observed. Okay? The 80% score should not be interpreted to mean that foods were not cooled 80% of the time. There's a big difference there. So another way to look at this is if I were to take, or if I were to make 10 cooling observations at one establishment and 9 were in compliance with the food code critical limits, the data item for cooling would be marked out because of the one that was seen that was done incorrectly. So the compliance status would be out, even though the establishment was actually cooling correctly 90% of the time. So that's an important way for us to measure observations. The reason we do that is because when we're looking at inspectional data, we often wonder if cold holding is cited more frequently because it's observed more. And this levels the playing field so that we can compare apples to apples. So data items are compared equally in this manner. And again, if you are interested in doing a risk factor study, our database handles all of that for you and the calculations for you, so you don't need to worry about it. Next slide, please. So this figure shows our primary 10 data items across the bottom with your out of compliance percentage measured on the left y-axis. And click once, please. So data items 1, 5, and 7 were most commonly found out of compliance at 72, 70, and 62.9%. respectively. And click one time, please. One more. There we go. So data items 2, 9, and 10 were found out of compliance least commonly at 5.5, 4.8, and 12.7. So this suggests that while delis are better at managing bare hand contact with ready-to-eat foods and ensuring foods are cooked to required temperatures and foods are reheated properly, there remains opportunity to gain a little better control over cooling, cold holding, and employee hand washing. And the one thing I'll point out on this slide, though, which is actually pretty impressive, is when you look at the numbers that I had shown earlier. So for data item 2, no bare hand contact, 5.5%. So we have a extremely high in compliance with no bare hand contact with ready-to-eat foods. And you'll see the same over there with cooking of raw animal foods. So very high in compliance for the cooking of raw animal foods when you compare it to all the other data items there. Advance the slide, please. Okay, so I mentioned previously that one of the objectives of the study was to look at correlations between food safety management systems and food safety practices. So a food safety management system refers to a specific set of actions and procedures that help achieve active managerial control. So while food safety management systems we know vary across the retail food service industry, the purposeful implementation of procedures, training, and monitoring are all consistent components within those food safety management systems. So for the purpose of our study, these are the 3 elements that we're going to use to assess the food safety management system. Click once, please. So the quick definitions is procedures are a defined set of actions for accomplishing a task in a way to minimize food safety risks. And click once, please. And training is how do you communicate that with your employees? So the process which the management uses to inform their employees of what those procedures are. Click one time, please. Monitoring. So the routine observations and measurements conducted to determine if food safety procedures are being followed. So they've trained them, are they also monitoring it? So taken collectively, these 3 elements are referred to as our establishment's PTM, and that's what I'll call it moving forward. During a data collection, the data collector assesses each food safety management system to determine the extent to which these PTMs are developed and implemented. So this is done for one randomly selected risk factor for each establishment. So the assessment criteria focuses on determining if a manager is able to describe and identify some key items. So for each procedure, training, monitoring question, we assess each one independently. So the answers for procedures don't affect the score for training. So obviously, if they don't have procedures, it's going to be a little harder to train, but they are assessed independently. So if they have, training and monitoring, the scores could be slightly different and it's averaged, and I'll show you how we average that going along. So the things that we're asking that we use to describe each of these categories are whether or not they can identify what the critical limits for the specific risk factor are, the tasks that are performed to ensure the critical limits are achieved. We want to know if they can identify specific employees that have been assigned the responsibility to correctly perform those tasks. and whether or not they have written materials such as standard operating procedures, posters, wall charts, or whatever they have that could support implementing their food safety management system. Then based on those management responses, the data collector uses a standardized protocol to rate each element of their food safety system, which is assessed independent of the overall risk factor compliance status. So what I mean by that is if a risk factor is found out during the data collection through an observation, that has no effect on the score. So if they have cooling is out, for instance, that doesn't affect the score. They might have great procedures, great training, great monitoring. So this is assessed 100% independent of that. Likewise, if they don't have any procedures, training, or monitoring, that has no effect on the outside data collection. So this part of the system is assessed using its own criteria and doesn't have an implication either way on the rest of the data collection. Next slide, please. So here are the descriptors of what each food safety management system score means. So as I just said, the study calculates a single overall PTM score by adding all the individual PTM ratings for each data item and dividing the number by the number of individual ratings. I will demonstrate this on the next slide. So it's just taking an average, basically. So the food safety management score can be treated as a continuous variable with possible values ranging from 1 to 4, 1 being a complete absence of management systems and 4 being a well-developed and documented food safety management system. So you can see our score descriptors there, 1 non-existent and 4 is well-developed and documented. Point out here that the only difference between a well-developed and documented is the presence of written materials or posters or the wall charts. So small difference between category 3 and 4 there. Next slide, please. So let's walk through a quick example here. So if the poor personal hygiene risk factor was selected as the area that the data collector was going to collect their food safety management system assessment, then a separate evaluation of the PTM would have been conducted for data items 1 and 2, because those were the data items associated with that risk factor, if you remember from that red box chart slide. So shown in this first table is a rating which would be given to each element for each data item for the procedures, training, and monitoring. So you see they got some 2s and 3s. And if we could click once, please. So what we do is when we add the values for all the elements and divide by the number of elements, we see that our overall value in this example equals 2.5. And click one time. So in the last table on the right, you'll see that because the value here was 2.5, that means that this particular Deli's food safety management system for poor personal hygiene would have been given the description of underdeveloped. Next slide, please. So using that, here are the results of our analysis. Of the 397 delis sampled, about 12% had non-existent food safety management systems, 56 were underdeveloped, 25.8 were well-developed, and 5.9 had well-developed and documented food safety management systems. And a reminder here, because it's important to look at this, is the difference between well-developed and documented is just whether those systems are documented in some type of written form that can be shown. And the reason that's important is because that improves sustainability over time, or we think that would be. So if you take that into consideration, you'll see that combined, it's almost 32% had well-developed or well-developed and documented when you put those two together. One last interesting statistic is that 40% of the multi-unit establishments that we looked at had well-developed or well-developed and documented food safety management systems, as compared to 6% of single unit establishments. So that's a significant difference in food safety management scores, which suggests that having those infrastructures is a benefit, or is helping those food safety management systems in the multi-unit operations have better developed systems. Next slide, please. So I said earlier that one of the other objectives of our study was to assess the impact food safety management systems had on food safety practices. So this is that first correlation I had mentioned. which I gave you the data on, and I said that our food safety management systems were the strongest predictor of data items being out of compliance. So this is what we're looking at here. So those delis with well-developed food safety management systems had significantly fewer food safety practices out of compliance as compared to those with the less developed food safety management systems. So the bar graph here in this slide is indicating that delis with non-existent food safety management systems, and click one time, please, they average 4.6 data items out of compliance. And then click one more. Well, we'll see that the delis with the well-developed and documented food safety management systems average 2.4. So establishments without a food safety management system were more than twice as many out of compliance data items as those with well-developed food safety management systems. So what are we saying here? When you had a well-developed food safety management system, you had half the number of risk factors out of compliance, and that's very significant. Next slide, please. Another objective was to assess the correlation between the level of certified food protection manager and the compliance status of data items. So during each data collection, the data collector obtained information about the scope and type of food protection manager certification that was obtained by Deli personnel. So our descriptors for the certified food protection manager assessment categories are listed on the slide. They're none, and none means that there was no certified food protection manager present, in charge, or employed. They didn't have a certified food protection manager. The employed means that there is a certified food protection manager employed, but that they are not present at the time of the data collection. And present means that they are employed and they were there at the time of the collection, but they weren't the person in charge. And then by default, obviously, person in charge means that they were employed, that they are present, and they are the person in charge at the time of the data collection. So that's all those are defined. And the results, if you can advance the mouse, thank you, is that of the 397, 33.5 had no certified food protection manager employed. And one more time, please. 51% had a certified food protection manager that was present and in charge. Next slide, please. So this slide illustrates the median primary data items out of compliance across all observations. So this means that for the delis we observed, we would likely see that at least 4 out of 10 data items were out of compliance. So this is our median metric here. So this is one of the major metrics we're using in our study that allows us to show if what we're doing is working, right? Because if the occurrence of risk factors changes over time, we would hope that in subsequent data collections, we see a trend to where this shifts to less than 4, showing an increase in compliance. So this is really, you know, the push behind doing your own risk factor data collection at a local level is setting that baseline and measuring trends over time to really take a hard look at the statistics and numbers to say, is what we're doing working? Because what we want to see is a shift and have that median number go down. So quick explanation on this slide so that you can see how it reads a little bit easier is that the median number of primary data items out of compliance is highlighted there for you as 4 in the middle. On the left, you'll see it's the number of primary data items out of compliance. So that's not the listing of our data items. That's just strictly how many were out on each inspection 0 through 10. So 2 could have been any 2. It just means 2 of the 10 were out. So you read across, you'll see that 2, for instance, had 72 establishments had 2 that are out. And then that you see the percentage and then the cumulative on the right. So you can look at this and see the good news is that there were no establishments that had all 10 primary data items out. You'll see that 46.8% of the delis, which equaled a total of 186, actually had 3 or fewer primary data items out of compliance. So that's some good news. Whereas 2.5% of the delis, which equaled 10, had no primary data items out of compliance. So there were a handful that had none that were out. Next slide, please. Okay, so delis that had a certified food protection manager who was the person in charge at the time of the data collection had significantly better food safety management system scores than those that did not have a certified food protection manager employed. Of the food safety practices investigated in this study, we saw that delis had the best control over ensuring no bare hand contact with ready-to-eat foods, and that raw animal foods were cooked to required temperature. There remains a need to gain better control over employee hand washing, and again, that includes both when to wash and how to wash, as well as cold holding of TCS foods. So delis that had a certified food protection manager who was the person in charge at the time of the data collection had significantly better food safety management scores than those that did not have a certified food protection manager who was present or employed. So that indicates that having a certified food protection manager present and in charge at all hours of operation significantly enhances food safety management systems and reduces the number of out of compliance food safety practices. Next slide, please. So I alluded at the beginning that we've done some work and improvement in our communication and outreach and education. So we've been working diligently to develop some innovative materials for our education and outreach. The supporting documents include a top-line report, which has all the data, a food safety management system fact sheet, which we've done in the past, and call to actions for both industry and regulators. Next slide, please. So the top line summary report was developed as a means to provide more of the data which was not included in the technical report and which was not presented in today's presentation. So we get frequent questions on all types of data collected in the study, such as what our temperature observation distributions were and some of the results of the secondary data items. So there are things we collect outside the 10 primary. We have our secondary data items. A lot of those questions that we ask of our operators. So there's more information that is in this top line report. So it's a summary that's accessible to everyone. It's put in an easily digestible way. So the data is easy for anyone to understand who wants to take a closer look at some of our study results. Next slide, please. Food Safety Management System fact sheet. This is a continuing document from our 2013-14 restaurant data collection. The document was very well received, and the feedback was that we should do this moving forward for each of our data collections. So we've again provided our Food Safety Management System fact sheets for this data collection. Next slide, please. So a call to action for industry. We wanted to make the data from the study more actionable. So you've come out with all this information. Well, what now? How can we use that? So remember that although the study is observational and not interventional, we have collected several decades of information across the different retail segments, and we felt that now is a good time to help industry as well as regulators understand what some interventions they can take might be. So we purposely wrote two separate documents to address the different needs of industry and regulators. This was also supported by a focus group that the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Food Safety and Inspection Service did, which indicated that separate messaging was necessary for industry and regulators when it came to delis, specifically for listeria control, which is what this first one is set up to explain. So I can't, for time's sake, go over the whole thing, but is set up as a call to action to kind of explain, what our data found, what listeria is and why it's important to control it, the benefits of a food safety management system and how it can help industry with improving compliance, as well as the last page of it is a clearinghouse of resources for industry, where we tried to put together all kinds of resources from across all the different industry segments of government and got it into one place so it's useful for industry. So if you're in industry, take a look at that. It's focusing on listeria. We hope that there'll be call to actions on other topics related to this coming out. And next slide, please. The last one is our call to action for regulators, which is very similar to the call to action for industry, but this focuses more on what regulations support proper date marking and disposition, as well as what resources are available for our state, local, territorial, tribal partners to improve the evaluation of food safety management systems for the date marking component. It also has information on how to assist industry in developing better food safety management systems, since we know that that's a key factor in lowering the occurrence of risk factors. And the next slide, please. If you have any questions, you can find all of these materials. So the call to industry, the call to action for regulators, our top line report, and all of the materials and at our website, which is listed there. And looks like I have 2 minutes to answer questions, but as other speakers have done, I will make sure to be on Pathloor and answer any questions in the chat.
Thank you, Mike. That was fantastic. I think we can ask a few questions here. Was the time conducting study controlled such that reheating would be observed more readily in the first few hours of opening?
So part of the training that we have for our data collectors is, as I said, they're doing basically a standardized inspection. So they're all standardized by CIFSAN, and we also go over all the protocol and materials. So yes, they're instructed on how to conduct an inspection. It would be the same type of inspection that you'd see in our FD 218 and 215 classes. We teach all of that stuff for a reason. So what a data collector does is it would look very much like a non-regulatory observational inspection. So when they arrive at the establishment, after handing the letter to the person in charge and introducing themselves with the purpose of the study, and it's voluntary, so being allowed into the establishment to work with them, they would do a quick walkthrough of the establishment to try and identify what processes are going on. So yes, we try and get to establishments at times where we would see these processes that we want to observe, working with a regulatory authority. And I forgot to mention that, by the way, we always invite the regulatory authority to accompany us on these data collections. So if they can give us any guidance to a good time to inspect, we'd certainly use that. But for data items such as cooling or reheating of foods, we would ask the questions. Do you have any foods cooling? Is that something you do? What are your processes? Anything that might be in the walk-in cooler from the night before? And we always try and make an observation on those type of things early in the data collection so that we have time to make a proper assessment on whether or not it's being done correctly. So for reheating, if it's a situation we can get there and see the beginning of the reheating process in the end, that's ideal, and same with cooling. Because of respect to industry and time allotted, we like to keep these data collections to 90 minutes. So if we're there and they happen to not be doing it, we're not going to intentionally hang out longer than expected to catch that, nor are we going to come back at another time. So if it happens that we're not there at the right time, it would be not applicable or not observed, depending on the situation, which you remember from our calculation is accounted for. So the out of percentage calculation is out over the total number in or out. So the not observed, not applicable don't have an effect on that score.
Thanks, Mike. Really quickly, how can a jurisdiction determine that statistically significant number of establishments to collect the data from?
That is a great question. So as I said, we're 95% confident within plus or minus 5% that what we're seeing is what's actually happening. If you're interested in doing your own risk factor study, you might not need to be 95%, maybe 85% is okay. So there are a number of online resources which you can contact me or your retail food specialist, and we can direct you to those. Our CIFSAN biostatistics, our statistician, has checked a few of them out and it says they're accurate. So there are some resources we have, and we are developing a toolkit, which we're going to put these resources into that a retail food specialist can use to help you get going. But one of the resources in that toolkit is going to be a tool that you can use to plug in your own numbers and see what your sample size needs to be, given what you want your confidence level to be. So we can help you out with that.
Thank you, Mike. We do have a couple more questions in the chat, so I appreciate that you stay online and answer those. There are very good questions, and everyone really loved your presentation. So thank you very much for your time.